My grandfather left a riddle instead of inheritance instructions, so I solved it and found what he hid in our basement walls. When Grandpa Theo died last spring, the whole family gathered for the will reading like vultures circling roadkill. My cousins whispered about his rumored fortune. Decades of owning the town's only hardware store had to amount to something substantial. Uncle Rick kept checking his watch, probably already planning how to spend his inheritance on that boat he'd been eyeing. But instead of dividing up bank accounts and property deeds, the lawyer handed us each a folded piece of paper with Grandpa's spidery handwriting. Where memories sleep in wooden beds, and tools once rested overhead, beneath the place where mason jars stood guard, your future waits behind what's hard. What the hell is this supposed to mean? Uncle Rick snapped, crumpling his copy. Where's the real will? The lawyer adjusted his glasses nervously. This is what Mr. Theodore left as his final instructions. He was quite specific that whoever solved the riddle would inherit everything. My cousins immediately started arguing about hiring private investigators and demanding the house be searched professionally. But I just stared at the paper, remembering summer afternoons in Grandpa's basement workshop. That night, while my relatives bickered over strategy, I drove to the old house. Mom had given me the spare key months ago when Grandpa's memory started failing. The basement still smelled like sawdust and WD-40, exactly how I remembered, where memories sleep in wooden beds. I looked around the workshop. Grandpa's old workbench dominated one corner, covered in decades of scratches and stains. But wooden beds, that had to mean something else. Then I remembered. Against the far wall stood Grandpa's pride and joy, a massive wooden tool cabinet he'd built himself in the 1960s. Each drawer was lined with felt, creating perfect resting places for his tools, wooden beds for his precious instruments, and tools once rested overhead. Above the cabinet, mounted on the wall, were the pegboards where Grandpa hung his larger tools. Hammers, levels, saws, all organized with obsessive precision. Beneath the place where mason jars stood guard, my heart started racing. On top of the tool cabinet sat rows of mason jars filled with nuts, bolts, screws, and washers. Grandpa's system for organizing hardware. They stood like sentries, guarding whatever lay beneath. Your future waits behind what's hard. I ran my hands along the back wall behind the cabinet. The paneling felt different in one section. Newer, slightly raised. When I pressed against it, it gave slightly. It took me 20 minutes to move the heavy cabinet away from the wall. Behind it, a section of paneling had been carefully cut and rehung. No nails or screws held it in place. The panel lifted away easily, revealing a hidden cavity stuffed with manila envelopes. The first envelope contained $47,000 in cash. The second held stock certificates worth at least 6 figures. The third was filled with gold coins. But the fourth envelope made my hands shake. Inside were dozens of photographs and a thick folder of documents. Pictures of my Uncle Rick meeting with developers, signing papers, shaking hands over briefcases full of cash. Documents showing how he'd been systematically stealing from Grandpa's business for 15 years, selling parcels of the family land without permission, even forging Grandpa's signature on loans. A handwritten note in Grandpa's shaky script was paperclipped to the front. I've known about Rick for years but needed proof. These photos were taken by the private investigator I hired. Rick thinks I'm a senile old fool, but I've been watching. The store is bankrupt because of him. He's been planning to contest my will and take everything. Don't let him destroy what our family built. My phone buzzed. A text from my cousin Danny. Uncle Rick hired a lawyer. He's claiming the riddle is invalid and demanding the house be searched tomorrow. I sat on Grandpa's old stool, staring at the evidence spread across his workbench. The workshop felt different now, not just a place of memories, but a command center where Grandpa had orchestrated his final battle against the son who'd betrayed him. Growing up, I'd spent countless hours down here while other kids played video games or hung out at the mall. Grandpa never minded my constant questions or the way I'd reorganize his tools when I was bored. He'd taught me how to use a level, how to measure twice and cut once, how to fix things that seemed permanently broken. Most people throw stuff away the minute it stops working, he'd always said. But everything can be repaired if you understand how it was built in the first place. I should have realized he was talking about more than furniture and appliances. The first time I noticed something was wrong was during Christmas dinner 2 years ago. Grandpa had always been the family storyteller, regaling us with tales of the hardware store's early days, the customers who'd become friends, the projects that had challenged him. But that Christmas, he barely spoke. When my cousin Bryce asked about the store's finances, Grandpa's face went dark. Ask your father, he'd said, glancing at Uncle Rick. He's been taking a more active role lately. Uncle Rick had laughed it off. Dad's just getting old. We're transitioning responsibilities gradually. But I'd caught the look that passed between them, Rick's warning glare and Grandpa's resigned sadness. At the time, I'd chalked it up to typical family tension about aging and independence. Now I understood it was something much darker. Another envelope caught my eye, smaller than the others, with my name written on the front in Grandpa's careful block letters. Zoe, if you're reading this, you solved my puzzle. I always knew you were the smartest grandkid, even when the others called you weird for preferring my workshop to their video games. You spent hours watching me work, asking questions about every tool and technique. You're the only one who truly understood what this place meant to me. Rick has been bleeding the business dry. The hardware store is 3 months behind on payments. He's been selling off pieces of the original family land to cover his gambling debts. Worse, he's convinced your aunt and your cousins that I'm senile, setting them up to challenge whatever will I leave behind. I can't confront him directly because he'll just deny everything and destroy the evidence. But I need someone I trust to expose him properly. The photographs are dated and verified by the investigator. The financial documents are copies of the originals, which Rick thinks he destroyed. There's more money hidden throughout the house, places only you would think to look because you helped me with my projects. Use it wisely. And remember, family isn't just about blood, it's about loyalty, honesty, and protecting what matters. The store's debts can be paid off with what I've saved. The business can be saved if someone who cares runs it properly. I'm hoping that someone is you. Love, Grandpa Theo P.S. Check behind the false back in my bedroom closet, under the loose floorboard in the kitchen pantry, and inside the hollow space I built into the banister post. Trust no one else with this information until Rick is dealt with. My hands were trembling as I folded the letter. Grandpa had known exactly what kind of chaos his riddle would create. While my relatives fought over who deserved what, he'd given me time to discover the truth and decide what to do with it. The mention of gambling debts explained so much. I remembered Uncle Rick's frequent trips to Atlantic City, always claiming they were business conferences, his new truck every 2 years, the expensive watch he'd started wearing, Aunt Linda's designer handbags that seemed beyond a hardware store manager's salary. I thought about all the family barbecues where Rick had complained about Grandpa's outdated business practices, how he'd roll his eyes when Grandpa insisted on ordering from longtime suppliers instead of cheaper alternatives, how he'd pushed for computerizing the inventory system, claiming it would increase efficiency. Now I realized he'd been positioning himself to have complete control over the books. I spent the next 3 hours following Grandpa's final treasure hunt. Behind the false back of his bedroom closet, I found another $23,000 and more documentation of Rick's fraudulent activities. The folder contained bank statements showing regular large withdrawals from the store's account, always signed with what looked like Grandpa's signature. But I'd helped Grandpa with paperwork countless times over the years. I knew his real signature, the way he dotted his I's, the distinctive loop in his T's. These signatures were close, but not quite right. Under the loose floorboard in the kitchen pantry was a safe deposit box key, and the deed to a small parcel of land Rick hadn't managed to steal yet. The deed was for 23 acres of prime real estate on the edge of town, right where the new shopping development was being built. I realized Rick hadn't just been stealing from the business. He'd been selling off family land and pocketing the proceeds while making it look like Grandpa was the one making poor financial decisions. The banister post yielded the biggest surprise, a USB drive labeled insurance policy in Grandpa's handwriting. Back in the basement, I plugged the drive into my laptop. The screen filled with video files, each one time-stamped and dated. Grandpa had installed hidden cameras throughout the hardware store. The first video showed Rick meeting with a local developer in the store's back office after hours. I watched my uncle hand over keys and documents, accepting a briefcase in return. The developer's voice was clear. "With the old man's signature on these sales contracts, we can break ground next month." "He signed them?" the developer asked. Rick's laugh was ugly. "Let's just say I've gotten really good at his handwriting." I paused the video, feeling sick. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was systematic fraud designed to make Grandpa look incompetent while Rick positioned himself as the responsible family member trying to clean up the mess. Video after video showed similar meetings. Rick forging Grandpa's signature on loans. Rick removing cash from the register and doctoring the books. Rick selling off inventory and keeping the profits. Rick on the phone with what sounded like his bookie, discussing payment schedules and interest rates. The worst video was Rick meeting with a man in an expensive suit, someone I didn't recognize. They were discussing Grandpa's mental health. "The old man's definitely losing it," Rick said. "Yesterday he accused me of stealing from the register. Completely paranoid. I'm thinking we need to have him evaluated, maybe get power of attorney transferred. That would certainly make our arrangement easier," the suited man replied. "The sooner we can finalize the land sales, the better. My clients are getting impatient." "Don't worry. Once I have legal control, we can move forward with everything. The hardware store, the house, all of it." I realized Rick hadn't just been stealing money. He'd been gaslighting Grandpa, making him question his own memory and judgment, while systematically looting everything he'd worked for. The final video was dated just 2 weeks before Grandpa's death. Rick was on the phone again, his voice harsh and impatient. "I don't care what the will says. I'll contest it. Claim he was senile. My lawyer says we can tie up the estate for years. By then, I'll have everything liquidated." I leaned back in Grandpa's chair, overwhelmed. He'd been carrying this burden alone for years, watching his own son destroy everything he'd built while pretending to care about the family. No wonder he'd seemed so tired lately. But there was something else in his expression during those final videos, a steely determination I recognized from my childhood. The same look he'd get when facing a particularly challenging repair job. He wasn't just documenting Rick's crimes, he was building a case. My phone rang. Uncle Rick. "Zoe, sweetheart, I hope you're not taking this riddle nonsense seriously. Your grandfather wasn't well these past few years. We need to get the house properly searched by professionals." I could hear the strain in his voice, the barely controlled panic. He was probably wondering if I'd already found something. "Actually, Uncle Rick, I think I might have figured out the riddle." Silence on the other end. "What do you mean?" "I'm at Grandpa's house now. I think I know what he meant about wooden beds and mason jars." "Don't touch anything!" His voice was sharp now, desperate. "We need to do this legally, with witnesses." "Why? Afraid of what I might find?" Another long pause. I could practically hear his mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew. "I'll be right over. Don't move anything until I get there." The line went dead. I quickly gathered all the evidence, stuffing it into a large duffel bag I found in Grandpa's closet. The cash, documents, photos, USB drive, and Grandpa's letter all went into the bag. I moved the tool cabinet back against the wall and replaced the panel, making sure everything looked untouched. As I worked, my mind raced through the implications. Rick wasn't just coming to see what I'd found. He was coming to make sure I didn't find anything at all. If there was evidence hidden in the house, he'd want to destroy it before anyone else could discover it. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the front windows. Uncle Rick's truck pulled into the driveway, followed by another car I didn't recognize. I met them at the front door. Rick had brought his lawyer, a thin, nervous man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. "Zoe, this is Attorney Morrison. He's helping the family navigate this complicated situation." Morrison stepped forward with an oily smile. "Miss Hartwell, your uncle is concerned about the validity of your grandfather's final instructions. We believe the proper course is to have the estate evaluated by neutral professionals." Up close, Morrison looked like the kind of lawyer who specialized in making problems disappear for wealthy clients. His suit probably cost more than I made in 3 months at my current job, and his manicured hands had never touched a tool in their life. "But I already solved the riddle," I said innocently. "Would you like to see what I found?" Rick's face went pale. "What did you find?" I led them down to the basement, my heart pounding. The workshop looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived. "The riddle mentioned wooden beds," I explained, pointing to the tool cabinet. "Those are the felt-lined drawers where Grandpa kept his tools. And overhead are the pegboards. The mason jars on top stand guard." Rick was staring at the wall behind the cabinet, his jaw clenched. I could see sweat beating on his forehead despite the cool basement air. "And behind what's hard means the wall itself," I continued. "But I can't move that cabinet by myself. It's way too heavy. Let's move it together," Morrison suggested, though he looked like he'd never lifted anything heavier than a briefcase. "If there's nothing there, we can put this whole riddle business to rest." Rick looked like he wanted to refuse, but Morrison was already examining the cabinet. Together, the three of us shifted it away from the wall. Rick did most of the heavy lifting, his movements sharp with barely controlled anxiety. I made a show of running my hands over the paneling, pretending to search for something unusual. "This section feels different," I said, pressing on the panel I'd already discovered. Morrison stepped forward eagerly. "Let me see." When he pulled the panel away, the cavity was empty except for dust and a few spider webs. "Well," Morrison said, clearly disappointed, "I guess the riddle was just the ramblings of an elderly man after all." But Rick wasn't buying it. His eyes were cold and suspicious as he stared at me. He knew Grandpa too well to dismiss the riddle as meaningless, and he could probably sense that something was off. "Zoe, have you been in this house before tonight?" "Just that one time a few months ago when Mom and I cleaned out some of Grandpa's clothes for donation." "And you didn't find anything then?" "Find what?" "I didn't even know about the riddle until today." Morrison was already putting his business card away. "I think we can safely conclude that your grandfather's instructions were metaphorical rather than literal. We should proceed with a standard estate distribution." "Actually," Rick said slowly, "I think we should search the rest of the house, just to be thorough." My stomach dropped. If they searched thoroughly, they might find the hiding spots Grandpa had mentioned in his letter. I hadn't had time to check all of them. "That seems unnecessary," Morrison said. "The riddle clearly pointed to this location." "Maybe there are other riddles," Rick insisted. "Dad was always playing games, leaving clues around the house. Remember the scavenger hunts he used to set up for the kids?" I did remember those hunts. Grandpa would spend hours creating elaborate puzzles that led us all over the house and yard, each clue building on the last until we found the final treasure, usually a bag of candy or a small toy. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to look around," Morrison agreed reluctantly. We spent the next hour going through the house room by room. Rick was methodical, checking behind picture frames, inside vases, under furniture cushions. He was looking for something specific, though he tried to make it seem casual. In the kitchen, he spent a long time examining the pantry, even getting down on his hands and knees to check the floorboards. I held my breath when he knelt right next to the loose board where I'd found the safe deposit box key, but he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. In the bedroom, he went straight to the closet, running his hands along the back wall. Again, he was inches away from discovering Grandpa's hiding spot, but the false back was so well concealed that he missed it. Morrison grew increasingly impatient as the search continued. "Mr. Hartwell, I really think we're wasting time here. If your father had intended to leave additional clues, he would have mentioned them in his instructions." "Just a few more minutes," Rick said, but I could see the frustration building in his face. He knew there should be something here, but he couldn't find it. When we reached the staircase, Rick examined the banister posts carefully, even trying to twist one of them. But Grandpa had been too skilled a craftsman. The hollow post looked identical to all the others. After they left, I sat in my car for 10 minutes, making sure they were really gone. Then I went back inside and retrieved the duffel bag from its hiding spot in the upstairs linen closet. Back home in my apartment, I spread everything out on my kitchen table and tried to figure out my next move. The evidence against Rick was overwhelming, but I needed to be smart about how I used it. I also needed to understand the full scope of what Rick had done. The documents I'd found were damning, but they might only represent a fraction of his crimes. First, I made copies of everything. Multiple copies, stored in different locations. I burned the videos onto several DVDs and uploaded them to a secure cloud storage account. If Rick somehow got to the originals, I wanted backups that he couldn't destroy. Then I started researching. I looked up the developers Rick had been meeting with, the pieces of property that had been sold, the loans that had been taken out in Grandpa's name. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd imagined. Rick hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been systematically dismantling everything Grandpa had built. The original family homestead, the land around the hardware store, even Grandpa's personal savings accounts. All of it had been liquidated or used as collateral for Rick's gambling debts and get-rich-quick schemes. The hardware store itself was in debt to the tune of $340,000. The building was mortgaged beyond its value. The inventory had been gradually sold off and replaced with cheaper alternatives that customers were already complaining about. But the most shocking discovery was a contract Rick had signed with the development company. He'd agreed to sell the entire property, the store, the house, all of it, as soon as he inherited. The developers planned to demolish everything and build a strip mall. Grandpa's life's work would be erased, replaced by a generic shopping center, and Rick would walk away with enough money to cover his debts and start over somewhere else. I researched lawyers who specialized in estate fraud and embezzlement cases. The lawyer I chose, Patricia Vance, had a reputation for taking on difficult family cases. When I called her office the next morning, her assistant scheduled an emergency consultation for that afternoon. Attorney Vance was nothing like Morrison. She was probably 60, with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Her office walls were covered with framed newspaper articles about high-profile cases she'd won. "Tell me everything," she said, settling back in her leather chair. I started with the riddle and worked my way through the discovery. When I played the first video from Grandpa's USB drive, her eyebrows shot up. "Your grandfather was thorough," she said, making notes. "These recordings would be admissible in court. The financial documents provide a clear paper trail. And the photographs," she shook her head. "Your uncle is looking at serious jail time. What about the inheritance? Rick is planning to contest the will. Based on this evidence, your uncle has no legal standing to contest anything. In fact, he'll be too busy dealing with criminal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, elder abuse. The district attorney will have a field day with this. Elder abuse? Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Your grandfather was in his 80s, and your uncle was systematically stealing from him while undermining his mental competency. It's a serious felony in this state. What should I do? First, we file a report with the police. Then we present this evidence to the probate court. Your grandfather's instructions were unorthodox but perfectly legal. You solved his riddle and discovered the inheritance as he intended. And the hardware store?" Attorney Vance smiled. "According to these financial documents, the business is salvageable. The debts your uncle created can be satisfied with the money your grandfather hid. You'll inherit a viable operation." But there was a complication I hadn't considered. The next morning, my cousin Danny called in a panic. "Zoe, Uncle Rick is telling everyone you broke into Grandpa's house and stole money. He's filing a police report." My blood went cold.
"What? He's claiming you must have found something last night and taken it. He says the riddle was just a distraction while you searched for cash or valuables." I could see Rick's strategy. If he couldn't find and destroy the evidence himself, he'd try to discredit me as a thief. It was actually clever. Turn my discovery of his crimes into evidence of my own criminal behavior. "Danny, you have to understand. I know you're not a thief," he interrupted. "But Uncle Rick is convincing."
"He's got Aunt Linda and some of the other relatives believing his story. He's saying Grandpa probably hid money in the house and you found it first." This was exactly what Grandpa had warned about. Rick was positioning himself as the responsible family member while painting me as opportunistic and dishonest. I called Attorney Vance immediately. "This is actually good for us," she said. "If your uncle files a false police report, it's another crime we can add to the list. But we need to get ahead of this. I'm calling Detective Warren right now." 3 hours later, I was sitting in the police station with Attorney Vance, Detective Warren, and Assistant District Attorney Chen. The conference room table was covered with printouts of Rick's financial crimes. "This is extensive," Detective Warren said, shaking his head as he reviewed the evidence. "How long did you say this had been going on?" "Based on the documents, at least 15 years, I replied. "But it escalated significantly in the past 3 years. AITA Chen was particularly interested in the videos. Hidden surveillance in a place of business can be tricky legally, but if Mr. Hartwell had reasonable suspicion of theft, it's probably admissible. And these conversations about forging signatures are damning." "What about Rick's claim that I stole money from the house?" I asked. Detective Warren smiled grimly. "We'll be arresting Mr. Hartwell this afternoon. I doubt he'll be in a position to pursue theft charges against anyone. But what if some of the family believes his story?" "Let them," Attorney Vance said. "Once the criminal charges are filed and the evidence becomes public, Rick's credibility will be destroyed. Your relatives will see exactly who they've been supporting." The arrest happened at Rick's house while he was having dinner with his family. According to my cousin Bryce, who texted me updates, Rick tried to claim the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Even when they put him in handcuffs, he was insisting that I was the real criminal. Aunt Linda broke down completely. She'd known about the gambling, she admitted to the police, but she'd thought Rick had gotten it under control. She had no idea how extensive his fraud had been. The family reaction was swift and brutal. My aunt filed for divorce immediately. My cousins, humiliated by their father's crimes, apologized and offered to help however they could. But the sweetest moment came when I walked into Hartwell's Hardware for the first time as the owner. Dolores, Grandpa's longtime assistant manager, was behind the counter, tears streaming down her face. "I knew your grandfather was up to something these past few months," she said, hugging me tight. "He kept asking strange questions about the inventory and the books, and he installed those cameras without telling anyone. You knew about the cameras? Honey, I've been working here for 23 years. I notice when new equipment appears overnight. I just figured he had his reasons. She was right. Dolores had been running the day-to-day operations while Rick focused on his schemes. She knew every supplier, every customer, every detail of the business. Dolores, I need to ask you something important. Did you ever see Rick taking money from the register or doing anything suspicious with the books? Her face darkened. I saw plenty, but I couldn't prove anything. And your grandfather made me promise not to say anything until the time was right. Grandpa asked you to keep quiet? About 6 months ago, he pulled me aside and said he was working on something. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I should wait for you to take over before talking about what I'd seen. What did you see? Dolores glanced around the empty store, then locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. Rick was skimming cash every day, she said. Not just a little, sometimes hundreds of dollars. He'd wait until I went to lunch. Then he'd open the register and take whatever he wanted. Did you tell Grandpa? I tried. But Rick had convinced him I was making mistakes with the daily tallies, made it seem like I was the one losing track of money. It was the same gaslighting technique Rick had used on Grandpa, making the victim question their own perceptions while the real criminal hid in plain sight. There's more, Dolores continued. Rick was marking up special orders and keeping the difference. A customer would order a specific tool or part, Rick would quote them a price, then order something cheaper and pocket the profit. How much money are we talking about? Over the years, probably close to 100,000 just from what I witnessed, and I wasn't here evenings or weekends. I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Rick hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen trust. Customers who'd relied on Hartwell's hardware for decades had been cheated by someone they considered family. We're going to make this right, I told Dolores. Every customer Rick cheated, every supplier he stiffed, every debt he created in Grandpa's name, we're going to fix all of it. You sure you want to take this on? Dolores asked gently. It's going to be a lot of work and most people your age aren't interested in running a hardware store. The truth was, I hadn't been sure until that moment. I'd been working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment. Taking over a hardware store would mean completely changing my life. But standing in Grandpa's store, surrounded by the tools and materials he'd spent decades organizing and caring for, I felt something I'd never experienced in my office job. Purpose. Would you be interested in becoming a full partner? I asked. I need someone I can trust, and you know this place better than anyone. Dolores's eyes widened. A partner? You mean that? I mean it. We'll split the profits 50-50 after we pay off Rick's debts. You handle day-to-day operations. I'll focus on getting us back to profitability. She hugged me again, this time sobbing with relief. Your grandfather would be so proud. The next several months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, financial restructuring, and business rebuilding. The criminal case against Rick moved surprisingly quickly. With video evidence and financial records, there wasn't much for him to contest. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but AITA Chen was determined to send a message about elder abuse. The case went to trial, and I had to testify about discovering the evidence and understanding Grandpa's riddle. Rick's defense strategy was to claim that Grandpa really had been suffering from dementia, and that the riddle proved his mental incompetence. They argued that Rick had been trying to protect the family assets from an elderly man who could no longer make sound decisions. It might have worked if not for the videos. Watching Rick forge signatures and discuss plans to have Grandpa declared incompetent destroyed any credibility his defense might have had. The most damning moment came when the prosecutor played the recording of Rick bragging about getting really good at his handwriting. The jury's faces showed exactly what they thought of a son who would steal from his elderly father. Rick was sentenced to 7 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. He'd be eligible for parole in 4 years, but the felony convictions meant he'd never be able to work in finance or business management again. But the real victory came 6 months later when Hartwell's hardware was thriving again. We'd paid off all of Rick's debts using Grandpa's hidden money and expanded our inventory. The community rallied around us once the truth about Rick's crimes came out. Customers who'd stopped shopping there because of declining quality and service returned in droves. Dolores and I made an excellent team. She handled the customers and suppliers, while I focused on marketing and modernizing our systems. I created a website and social media presence that showcased our unique inventory and personalized service. We started offering workshops on home repair and DIY projects taught by local contractors and craftspeople. The classes were packed every weekend, bringing in new customers and strengthening our connection to the community. But the biggest change was in how we operated. Unlike Rick, who'd focused on maximizing short-term profits, Dolores and I prioritized building long-term relationships. We honored every warranty, followed up on special orders, and went out of our way to help customers find solutions to their problems. I kept Grandpa's workshop exactly as he'd left it, tools hanging in their precise positions, mason jars standing guard over his memory. Sometimes I'd go down there when the store got busy, running my hands over his workbench and remembering the quiet afternoons we'd spent together. One day, about 8 months after taking over, I was in the workshop when I noticed something odd. One of the mason jars was sitting slightly askew, not perfectly aligned with the others like Grandpa always kept them. Inside the jar, beneath the nuts and bolts, was a small brass key I'd never seen before. The key opened a safety deposit box at the bank across the street from the hardware store. Inside were more documents, these ones dating back to the founding of the business in 1952. Grandpa had kept every important paper from the past 70 years, deeds to property Rick thought he'd sold. original contracts with suppliers, insurance policies Rick had claimed were lost, even the incorporation papers for the business, showing that it had always been structured as a family trust rather than a sole proprietorship. But the most important document was Grandpa's real will. Not the simple riddle he'd left with the lawyer, but a comprehensive legal document that laid out his true intentions for the business and property. According to the will, I wasn't just inheriting the hardware store. I was inheriting a legacy that was meant to be preserved for future generations. The document established a family trust that would keep the business in the family while preventing any single person from destroying it the way Rick had tried to do. More importantly, the will revealed that Rick had never actually been part owner of the business. Grandpa had given him a management position and a salary, but the ownership had always remained in the family trust. All of Rick's fraudulent sales and mortgages were void. He'd never had the legal authority to make those transactions. Working with attorney Vance, we unwound every fraudulent deal Rick had made. The property he'd sold was returned to the family trust. The mortgages he'd taken out were declared invalid. Even the development contract was voided. The developers who'd planned to demolish the store and build a strip mall were furious, but their legal challenges went nowhere. They'd knowingly entered into contracts with someone who didn't have the authority to make those agreements. The revelation completely changed the financial picture. Instead of inheriting a struggling business burdened with debt, I'd inherited a valuable property and a profitable operation that had been artificially suppressed by Rick's sabotage. 12 months after solving Grandpa's riddle, Hartwell's hardware was not just surviving, it was expanding. We bought out the failing electronics store next door and turned it into a dedicated tool and equipment center. We hired 3 more employees, including 2 recent high school graduates who reminded me of myself at their age, eager to learn and hungry for hands-on experience. I also started a mentorship program, partnering with the local community college to provide internships for students studying construction and engineering. Grandpa would have loved seeing young people learning trades and developing practical skills, but the project I was most excited about was still in the planning stages. The night before Rick's sentencing, I'd visited Grandpa's grave for the first time since the funeral. I brought a photo of the restored hardware store, the books showing we were back in the black, and a copy of the local newspaper article about our expansion. "I figured it out, Grandpa," I said, placing the articles on his headstone. "Not just the riddle, but what you were really trying to teach me. Family isn't about blood or birthright. It's about keeping promises and protecting what matters." A year later, I found one final surprise. While renovating the store's office, I discovered a loose brick in the wall behind Grandpa's old desk. Inside was another envelope with my name on it. "Zoe, if you're reading this, it means you saved the business and Rick is facing justice. I'm proud of you for finishing what I started. There's one more thing you should know. The deed to the original family homestead, the 200 acres where our great-grandfather first settled, was never actually sold. Rick forged those documents too, but the real deed is in my safe deposit box. The key was in the pantry. That land has been in our family for 4 generations. Now it's yours. Build something good there. Something that will last long after we're all gone. Love, Grandpa Theo P.S. Check the loose brick 2 spaces to the left of this one." The second brick contained another $15,000 and a hand-drawn map of the original family property, showing where our great-grandfather had planned to build a sawmill that was never constructed. The land was beautiful, 200 acres of mixed forest and meadow, with a creek running through the center and a small lake in the northeast corner. Rick had tried to sell it to developers for a fraction of its true value, but the forged deed meant the sale had never been legally valid. Standing at the spot where great-grandfather had planned his sawmill, I could see exactly what Grandpa had envisioned. Not just a business, but a complete operation that would showcase sustainable forestry and traditional craftsmanship. Using the sustainable logging practices I'd researched and local labor from the community college program, I started planning the sawmill our family had always dreamed of. The hardware store would provide the seed money, and the land would provide the raw materials. But it would be more than just a business. I envisioned workshops where people could learn traditional woodworking techniques, a visitor center that showcased the history of the family and the land, maybe even a small museum dedicated to the tools and crafts that built our community. Dolores was enthusiastic about the project. "Your grandfather talked about that sawmill for years," she said. "He'd study those old maps and dream about what it could have been." "What stopped him?" "Rick," she said simply. "Every time your grandfather brought up expansion or new projects, Rick would find reasons why it was too risky or too expensive. He wanted to keep the business small and manageable so he could control it better." Now I understood another layer of Rick's sabotage. He hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been stealing dreams. Every time Grandpa had tried to build something lasting, Rick had found ways to discourage or derail those plans. The sawmill project became my way of honoring not just Grandpa's memory, but his unfulfilled ambitions. I spent months working with architects and engineers to design a facility that would be both functional and beautiful. The main building would be constructed from timber harvested on the property using traditional joinery techniques. Solar panels would provide clean energy, and a water wheel powered by the creek would run some of the machinery. The most important feature was the workshop space where visitors could learn traditional woodworking skills. I wanted to create a place where knowledge could be passed down from one generation to the next, just like Grandpa had passed his knowledge down to me. But the project faced opposition from an unexpected source: my own family. Some of my cousins, still embarrassed by their father's crimes, thought I was being too ambitious. They worried that expanding beyond the hardware store would attract unwanted attention and remind people of the scandal. "Why can't you just run the store and leave it at that?" my cousin Bryce asked during a tense family meeting. "You've proven your point. Everyone knows Dad was wrong." "This isn't about proving a point," I replied. "It's about fulfilling Grandpa's vision for what our family business could become." "But the sawmill is risky," my cousin Amanda added. "What if it fails? What if you lose everything Grandpa worked for?" Their concerns were understandable, but they missed the larger picture. Grandpa hadn't just left me a business, he'd left me a responsibility to build something meaningful and lasting. "Grandpa didn't preserve this land and this business just so it could stay exactly the same forever," I said. "He preserved it so future generations could build on what he started." I showed them the plans for the sawmill, the research I'd done on sustainable forestry, the partnerships I'd established with local schools and environmental groups. "This isn't just about making money," I continued. "It's about creating something that serves the community and preserves traditional skills that are being lost." Slowly, they began to understand. The sawmill wouldn't just be a business. It would be a living memorial to everything Grandpa had valued: craftsmanship, community, and connection to the land. The project took 2 years to complete, but it was worth every moment of planning and construction. The grand opening of Hartwell's Heritage Sawmill drew over 1,000 visitors. Local officials praised the project as a model of sustainable development. Environmental groups highlighted our forest management practices. Craftspeople from across the region came to see the traditional machinery and workshop spaces. But the moment that meant the most was when Dolores cut the ribbon with a handsaw Grandpa had owned for 40 years. "Thea would have been so proud," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He always said the family business wasn't about selling things. It was about helping people build the lives they wanted." That evening, after the last visitor had left, I sat alone in the sawmill's main workshop. The space smelled like fresh sawdust and possibility. Shafts of evening sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the hand tools displayed on the walls. Sometimes late at night, when I'm working on business plans in what used to be Grandpa's workshop at the hardware store, I can almost hear him chuckling about his riddle. He knew exactly what he was doing, not just with the hidden money or the evidence against Rick, but with the challenge itself. He could have simply left me everything in a traditional will. Instead, he made me prove I understood what the business really meant, what the family legacy was truly worth. Uncle Rick thought inheritance was about taking what you're owed, but Grandpa taught me it's about earning what you're given and building something worthy of passing on. The riddle wasn't just about finding hidden treasure, it was about discovering who I really was and what I was capable of protecting and building. Rick was released on parole after serving 4 years. I heard through family gossip that he'd moved to another state and was working as a night shift security guard. He'd lost his house, his marriage, and any chance of rebuilding his reputation. Part of me felt sorry for him. He'd thrown away everything: his father's love, his family's respect, his own integrity, for what amounted to a few years of unsustainable spending. But mostly, I felt grateful that Grandpa had seen through Rick's deception and taken steps to protect what really mattered. 3 years after solving the riddle, I received an unexpected visitor at the hardware store. A young woman about my age with tired eyes and calloused hands approached the counter with an old photograph. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for information about my great-grandfather. I think he might have worked here a long time ago." The photograph showed a man in work clothes standing in front of a building that looked like an earlier version of our store. "That's definitely our building," I said, studying the image. "The sign's different, but the architecture is the same." "When do you think this was taken?" "Probably the 1960s. My great-grandfather was named Vincent Kowalski. Family legend says he was a master carpenter who helped build half the houses in this town." I felt a chill of recognition. I'd seen that name somewhere in Grandpa's papers. "Wait here," I said, heading back to the office. In the filing cabinet where I kept Grandpa's historical documents, I found what I was looking for: employment records from the 1960s. Vincent Kowalski had worked for Hartwell's Hardware for 15 years, specializing in custom millwork and architectural details. But there was more. In Grandpa's personal notes, I found several references to Vincent's exceptional skill and character. Grandpa had considered him not just an employee, but a friend and collaborator. "Your great-grandfather was one of my grandfather's most trusted workers," I told the young woman when I returned. "According to these records, he helped design and build custom features for dozens of homes in the area." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm trying to piece together his story. My family lost touch with his work history after he died." "What's your name?" "Carmen Kowalski Rodriguez. I'm a carpenter myself, actually. I've been traveling around trying to find examples of his work and learn about his techniques. I made a decision that I knew Grandpa would have approved of." "Carmen, would you be interested in teaching some workshops at our sawmill? We're always looking for skilled craftspeople who can demonstrate traditional techniques." "You have a sawmill?" I told her about the Heritage Project, the sustainable forestry practices, and the educational programs we'd developed. By the time I finished, Carmen was grinning widely. "My great-grandfather would have loved this place," she said. "He always said the most important thing wasn't just building things, but teaching others how to build them properly." Carmen became our first master craftsperson in residence. She taught workshops on traditional joinery techniques, hand tool woodworking, and architectural restoration. Her classes were always packed, and she became an integral part of our educational mission. More importantly, through her research into her great-grandfather's work, we discovered that Vincent had helped Grandpa design and build many of the custom features in the original hardware store. The elaborate woodwork in the front office, the hand-carved details around the windows, even some of the display cases, all were examples of Vincent's artistry. It was another reminder that Grandpa's legacy wasn't just about our family. It was about the entire community of craftspeople and workers who'd contributed to building something lasting. Today, 5 years after solving Grandpa's riddle, Hartwell's Hardware and Heritage Sawmill employs 23 people and serves customers from 3 counties. We've expanded our educational programs to include partnerships with universities studying sustainable forestry and traditional building techniques. The business is thriving, but more importantly, it's fulfilling the mission Grandpa always envisioned: preserving knowledge, serving the community, and building things that last. I still live in the apartment above the hardware store, in rooms that Grandpa had occupied for 40 years. Sometimes I'll find things he left behind: a note tucked inside a book, a tool he'd specially modified for a particular job, a photograph of a project he'd been proud of. Each discovery feels like another piece of the riddle, another lesson about what it means to build a legacy worth inheriting. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure Grandpa left me. Not the hidden money or the successful business, but the understanding that inheritance isn't about what you receive, but what you choose to do with what you're given. The riddle taught me that family isn't just about blood relationships, but about shared values and commitment to something larger than yourself. Grandpa could have simply written my name on a will and left me everything directly. Instead, he created a challenge that forced me to prove I understood what all of it really meant. Rick failed that test long before the riddle was ever written. He saw the business as something to be exploited rather than nurtured, the land as something to be sold rather than preserved, and Grandpa as an obstacle rather than a teacher. But Grandpa knew that someday, someone in the family would understand what he'd really built and why it mattered. The riddle was his way of finding that person and ensuring that his life's work would continue in the right hands. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I hadn't solved the riddle. Rick would have contested the will, probably successfully. The business would have been liquidated, the land sold to developers, and everything Grandpa had worked for would have disappeared. Instead, because of a few lines of poetry hidden in a basement workshop, the legacy lives on and grows stronger every year. That's the real magic of Grandpa's riddle. It wasn't just a puzzle to be solved, but a transformation waiting to be discovered. He didn't just leave me an inheritance, he left me a purpose. And every day as I walk through the hardware store and the sawmill, surrounded by the tools and traditions he loved, I'm grateful for the lesson hidden in those 4 simple lines: that the most valuable things we inherit aren't found behind walls or locked in vaults, but discovered within ourselves when we're challenged to become worthy of what we've been given.